Solve this, and I'll give you $100 million. The words landed in the room like a dropped crystal glass, clean, sharp, and impossible to ignore, just as every screen in the Skylab flashed from calm blue to emergency red, security breach. For half a second, the penthouse-level conference suite looked like a cathedral built out of glass and money, floor-to-ceiling windows, a skyline glittering beyond them, marble so polished it caught the chandelier light like water, and the faint scent of lemon wax still lingering where someone had made perfection shine. Then the alarm chime pulsed again, soft but relentless, and every voice in the room vanished into a silence that felt expensive. Omar Sterling stood at the head of the table, tailored suit immaculate, cufflinks catching the light as he held up a stylus like a judge holding a gavel. Around him, executives in charcoal suits and smart dresses sat frozen with champagne flutes halfway to their lips, the kind of people who measured trust in signatures and numbers with 8 zeros. A $3 billion deal was supposed to be signed tonight. A live demo was supposed to seal it. Instead, the AI system they'd been praising a moment ago had locked itself like a vault. Who touched my console? Omar's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It threaded through the room with calm authority, the kind that makes even confident people straighten their backs. At the edge of that polished world, Avery Bennett stood behind a service cart, hands wrapped around a silver tray so tightly her knuckles looked pale against her brown skin. 17. Quiet. Dressed in a simple navy uniform that blended into the background the way shadows do. Next to her, her mother Grace kept her head slightly bowed, the posture of someone who had learned that being noticed in rooms like this was rarely a gift. Victor Haynes, the COO, turned with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, and pointed at Avery as if she were a smudge on the marble. It was her, he said, bright and easy. The maid's kid. She was hovering. A few people laughed, small, quick sounds that tried to pretend this was harmless, like an inside joke. The room's attention snapped to Avery, and she felt it the way you feel a spotlight on your face. Hot, exposing, unfair. Grace's fingers twitched at her side, a silent plea for Avery to shrink, to disappear, to be safe. Omar's gaze followed Victor's finger without haste, and when it met Avery's eyes, something in his expression sharpened. Not cruelty, not kindness, just interest edged with impatience. You want to be in the center of my room? He asked, as if she'd chosen it. Then earn it. He tapped the screen. Lines of code and a moving pattern of numbers swirled like a storm trapped behind glass. Fix the breach, he said. Restore the system. 1 minute. The executives leaned in, hungry for spectacle. Victor's smile widened, satisfied. Avery's heartbeat thudded loud in her ears, and she hated that her hands were shaking because she knew what they saw. A kid in a borrowed uniform, a nobody in a room of giants. But her eyes didn't go to Victor. They went to the screen. Because beneath the flashing red, beneath the panic, she saw something else. One tiny rhythm out of place. One line that didn't belong, like a wrong note in a song she'd heard her whole life. Omar's voice cut through the hush, cool as the room's 68-degree air. Solve this, he repeated, and then, with the faintest tilt of his head toward Grace, he added, or your mother clears her locker tonight. The timer in the corner of the main display began to count down, and the room that had been built for celebration suddenly felt like it had been built for judgment. This was not a casual gathering with polite applause and networking smiles. This was a closed-door showcase on a floor so high the city looked like a field of lights, a place where a signature could move markets before midnight. Omar Sterling had flown in with a reputation that filled the room before he ever spoke, the kind of billionaire whose name did not appear in gossip columns as often as it appeared in board minutes and bank memos. Sterling Horizon Capital had been circling a partnership worth $3 billion, and tonight was meant to be the final step. A flawless demonstration of a new artificial intelligence security platform that could protect entire portfolios, hospitals, and critical infrastructure with a single command. The executives sitting around the obsidian table had already rehearsed their congratulations. The champagne had already been poured. The only people who had not been invited to feel important were the ones making the place shine. Grace Bennett had worked in buildings like this for years, polishing marble until it reflected faces like mirrors, folding napkins into crisp triangles, learning which doors to close softly and which voices to never interrupt. She carried herself with a quiet professionalism that made her nearly invisible on purpose, because invisibility kept you employed. Avery, her daughter, was not supposed to be here at all, not in a room where a single chair probably cost more than their monthly rent. But Grace could not leave her alone tonight, not with late hours in an unfamiliar city. So Avery came in the only way a teenager without connections could. She stood behind a service cart and tried to look like she belonged to the furniture. She had that kind of stillness that adults mistake for weakness, the kind that comes from watching and learning when you are not allowed to speak. Victor Haynes, the chief operating officer, was the opposite. He was loud without raising his voice, sharp without ever appearing angry, and he moved through the room like he owned its oxygen. He had been waiting for something to blame, because blame is a currency when you want to look powerful. Now he had chosen Avery the way a bored man chooses a target at a carnival booth. Across the table, Dr. Nolan Price, the lead engineer behind the platform, looked as if the red warning lights were burning behind his eyes. His hands hovered near his laptop but did not touch it, because touching the wrong thing in front of Omar Sterling was how careers ended. Nolan knew the system was not simply glitching. He could feel it in the pattern of the alert, too clean and timed, like a lock snapping shut from the inside. He also knew that in rooms like this, truth did not always win quickly, confidence did. And confidence, right now, belonged to Omar, to Victor, to the people who had never had to ask permission to be taken seriously. Avery felt her mother's fear beside her, a fear that smelled like lemon polish and overtime, a fear that whispered that dignity was expensive and they could not afford it. But Avery's eyes stayed on the screen because the numbers were not just numbers to her. They were a language, and she had spent years learning that language in the margins of other people's lives. The countdown reached 58 seconds, and Omar's calm gaze did not move. In that silence, Avery realized the real test was not the system. It was whether she would disappear, like everyone expected, or step forward while the world watched. The Skylab sat nearly 900 feet above the street, wrapped in glass the way a jewel is wrapped in velvet, and the city below looked softened by distance, like someone had sprinkled 1,000 candles across a dark tablecloth. Inside, everything was designed to whisper power without ever raising its voice. Marble veined like frozen smoke, leather chairs that gave slightly when the richest people in the room shifted their weight, and a long strip of warm light embedded in the ceiling that made every watch and ring glint at the slightest movement. Even the air felt curated, held at a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to keep nerves sharp and expensive cologne from turning heavy. Grace Bennett had cleaned spaces like this for so long that she could tell what kind of money lived here by the details most people never noticed, like the way the lemon polish smelled fresh instead of cheap, and how the flowers in the corner were real, not an arrangement meant to last forever. Avery stood where she was supposed to stand, just behind the line where importance began, her sneakers quiet on the spotless floor, her palms still damp against the metal handle of the service cart. On the main wall, the display looked like a storm trapped behind glass. Cascading symbols, diagnostic graphs, a pulsing warning band across the top, and the countdown clock shrinking the room's patience second by second. The executives watched as if this were entertainment, as if a teenager's humiliation could be another appetizer before the deal was served. Victor Haynes leaned back with his hands folded, the posture of a man who loved an audience. "She has 1 minute," he said, smiling at someone across the table, "and then we can get back to grown-up work." A few quiet chuckles rose again, careful and polite, the way people laugh when they want to belong. Omar Sterling did not laugh. He simply looked at Avery as though he were studying an unfamiliar tool, deciding whether it was useful or disposable. Grace's eyes flicked to her daughter, then down to the floor, then back again, as if she could shield Avery with nothing but hope. Avery felt that hope like a weight. Her mother's paycheck kept the lights on. Her mother's job paid for groceries and bus passes and the kind of quiet sacrifices that never showed up in speeches. Losing it would not be dramatic in a way this room understood. It would be ordinary and cruel, the slow kind of disaster that happens when rent is due and there is no backup plan. But Avery's mind did not stay on fear for long, because the screen was speaking in a language she had taught herself to hear. She remembered the hallway outside the building's conference rooms, years ago, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with a borrowed notebook while her mother worked late, listening to training videos through cheap earbuds, pausing and replaying until the patterns made sense. She remembered writing equations on the back of discarded printouts, the ink sometimes smearing because her hands still smelled like cleaning solution. Adults had walked past her then without seeing her, as if knowledge was something that only belonged to people wearing suits. Now that same knowledge shimmered on the wall in front of her, and beneath the flashing warnings she saw a tiny inconsistency, like a heartbeat that skipped at the wrong moment. It was not random. It was placed. Dr. Nolan Price stared at the display with a tight jaw, and when his eyes met Avery's for the briefest second, his expression cracked into something human, desperation. The countdown dropped again, and Victor's smile widened as if he could already taste the outcome. Omar's voice stayed calm, almost bored. "Time is running," he said. And in that instant, Avery realized she was not just being tested. She was being set up. Victor rose slowly, as if he had all night, and the sound of his chair sliding over the marble was sharper than the alarm chime. He walked toward Avery with the confident ease of a man who had never been told no, stopping just close enough to make her feel crowded without ever touching her. "We have investors watching this," he said, his voice smooth, almost friendly, the way people sound when they are certain they will win. "We have compliance officers on standby. We have reputations on the line." He glanced back at the table, inviting the room to join him, then returned his gaze to Avery like she was an object that had wandered into the wrong aisle. "And now we have a security breach," right after the service staff was near the console. A few executives exchanged looks that said they did not want to be cruel, but they wanted to stay safe, and safety in rooms like this often meant agreeing with whoever spoke the loudest. Grace's breath caught, small and quiet, and she stepped forward half an inch before stopping herself, because she knew what happened to employees who challenged powerful guests. Omar Sterling remained still, hands loosely folded, his expression unreadable, his patience measured in seconds and millions. "This is your moment," Victor continued, turning the humiliation into a performance. "If you are as harmless as you look, you will fail quickly. If you are not, you will prove it in front of everyone." He tilted his head toward Grace, as if he were doing her a favor. "Your mother is a good worker. It would be a shame to lose her over something careless." The words were not shouted. They were placed, carefully, like a weight set on Grace's shoulders. Grace's eyes flickered with panic, then with something like apology, as if she had failed her daughter simply by bringing her into this world. Avery felt the room closing in, felt the polished perfection around her becoming a trap, because in a place this clean, a girl like her was always the stain people wanted to wipe away. The countdown clock kept falling, and with each number, Victor's smile grew more satisfied. 39 seconds, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Plenty of time for a prodigy, right? More laughter, thinner this time, unsure. Dr. Nolan Price pressed his lips together, his fingers curling into his palm under the table. He looked at the screen, then at Avery, and in that look was a message he could not say out loud. "This is wrong, and you see it too." Avery forced her hands to stop shaking by gripping the cart one last time, then letting go. She stepped forward, the soles of her sneakers making a soft sound that somehow felt louder than the entire skyline outside. She did not look at Victor. She looked past him, straight to the wall of code, because the pattern was still there, the tiny misalignment that did not belong, repeating at precise intervals like a signature. It was not a random glitch. It was a planted door. It was the kind of mistake that only a person who expected no one to notice would dare to leave behind. Avery swallowed, tasting lemon polish in the back of her throat, and lifted her chin just enough to be heard, without sounding like she was begging. "I can fix it," she said, her voice steadying as the sentence left her mouth. Victor raised his eyebrows, delighted, as if she had walked right into his trap. Omar's eyes narrowed by a fraction, interest sharpening. "Then speak," Omar said, calm and cold. "Tell me what you need." The countdown hit 30 seconds, and Avery made her choice. Omar Sterling studied Avery the way he studied risk, with the same calm focus he used to decide whether a deal lived or died. The red warning band still pulsed across the wall, painting faint color onto the marble and onto the faces of people who were suddenly afraid to blink. "Tell me what you need," he repeated, and his voice carried a quiet impatience that made the room feel smaller. Avery did not rush to fill the silence with excuses. She kept her eyes on the display, tracking the repeating anomaly like a drummer hearing a beat that nobody else could. Then she spoke carefully, not because she was unsure, but because every word in this room had a price. "I need 60 seconds without interruptions," she said. "I need a pen and one sheet of paper. And I need to see the system log, read only, for the last 5 minutes." Victor let out a soft laugh, the kind that pretended to be charming. "She wants the logs," he announced, glancing around as if he expected applause. "That is adorable. Next she will ask for a corner office and a security badge." A few people smiled out of habit, then stopped when Omar did not react. Omar's gaze shifted to Nolan Price. "Can she see it?" Nolan hesitated, because saying yes in front of Victor could be dangerous, and saying no in front of Omar could be fatal for his career. "Read only access, yes," Nolan said at last, keeping his voice steady. "It cannot change anything. It will only display timestamps and events." Omar looked back at Avery. "If I give you that, and you fail, do not blame anyone else," he said. "Do not claim you were pressured. Your mother will still be done here tonight." Grace flinched, a tiny movement that would have gone unnoticed in any other room, but Avery felt it like a tug on her heart. For a moment, Avery imagined their small apartment, the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the bus route Grace took before sunrise, the way her mother carried exhaustion like a coat she could never take off. The threat was not dramatic to these executives. To Avery, it was a cliff. She lifted her chin. "I understand," she said. Omar's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he had expected pleading and received something harder. He made a small gesture with his hand. The countdown clock stopped at 27 seconds, frozen mid-crisis. The sudden stillness made the room exhale all at once, not in relief, but in surprise. "You have 1 minute," Omar said. "Not because you asked, because I want to see if you can do what my experts could not do in the last 10. Victor's smile tightened. "This is a waste of time," he muttered, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching for Avery to embarrass herself. Nolan rose and moved quickly, opening a secure panel on his laptop and projecting a narrow column of log entries onto a side screen. The timestamps marched downward in perfect order, each line clean, clinical, and indifferent to the human tension in the room. Avery stepped closer, close enough to read, close enough to feel the cold air from the vents brush her cheek. Nolan slid a legal pad toward her with a hand that trembled just slightly, as if he was handing over his last chance. Avery picked up the pen, and the moment the tip touched paper, the noise of the room faded. There was only the pattern now, the repetition, the tiny wrong note that kept returning at the same interval, and Avery's mind, steady as a metronome, began to count. Avery's pen moved fast, not frantic, the way it moves when the hand trusts the mind behind it. She wrote down the timestamps from the log as if she were copying a melody. 9 hours, 41 minutes and 12 seconds. 9 hours, 41 minutes and 24 seconds. 9 hours, 41 minutes and 36 seconds. Each event spaced exactly 12 seconds apart. That was what made it wrong. Real breaches were messy. Real accidents were uneven. This was a metronome. Avery glanced up at the main display, then back to the log, syncing the pulse of the red warning band with the rhythm of the entries. 12 seconds. 12 seconds. 12 seconds again. The room held its breath, and the only sound was the soft scratch of ink on paper and the faint hum of air conditioning trying to keep up with a room full of tension. Victor Haynes shifted his weight, impatient, then smirked as if he could already see the ending. "She is writing," he said, just loud enough to poison the silence. "Is she composing a poem for the breach?" No one laughed this time. Omar Sterling did not even look at him. Omar's attention stayed on Avery, and that attention felt heavier than the marble. Avery did not answer Victor. She did not even glance his way. She kept reading. One line in the log repeated with a small variation, like a fingerprint. An authentication token appeared, clean and valid, but it showed up when it should not have. It was labeled as an internal maintenance action, and the system treated it like a trusted key. Avery underlined it and wrote one word beside it, placed. Then she followed the next field, the source tag, the part most people ignored because it looked like boring hardware information. The source was not outside. It was local. It was inside the room. Avery's throat tightened, not from fear now, but from certainty. She traced the source identifier again, then looked at Nolan Price. His eyes were fixed on her notepad, and his face had that strained, careful stillness of someone watching a truth approach. Avery lowered her voice just enough that it would not carry to the whole table, but enough that Omar could still hear if he leaned in. "The breach is not coming from the internet," she said. "It is coming from a trusted device in this room." Victor let out a short laugh, too sharp to be friendly. "That is convenient," he said. "Blame the room. Blame the air. Blame the furniture." Avery kept going. She pointed at the log line without touching the screen, as if even her fingertips were not allowed on their world. "This token appears every 12 seconds, exactly," she said, steady. "It triggers a lock routine, and then it checks whether the system is still locked. That is why it keeps flashing even after resets." Nolan swallowed. "That would mean someone set a loop," he murmured, half to himself. Avery nodded once. "A loop with permission," she said. "That is the important part." Omar's posture changed slightly, a small forward tilt, like a predator noticing a detail. "Can you stop it?" he asked. Avery took a breath, then made a decision that felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge. "Yes," she said. "But I need Dr. Price to do one thing, and I need you to watch who reacts." Omar's eyes narrowed. "Speak clearly," he said. Avery lifted her notepad so Nolan could see her handwriting. "There is a maintenance task running under a trusted profile," she said. "It is named to look harmless. It is not. Dr. Price needs to pause that task, then isolate the trusted device that is feeding it." Victor's smile faltered for the first time, just a flicker, like a crack in glass. Avery saw it. Omar saw it too. The frozen countdown clock on the main screen still held at 27 seconds, waiting for Omar's command to resume. Omar looked at Nolan. "Do it," he said, calm as ever. Nolan's fingers hovered over his keyboard, and Avery, still holding the pen, circled one final line in the log. The line that carried a name-like identifier she had not wanted to read out loud until she was sure. Then she whispered, barely moving her lips, "The source tag matches Victor Haynes's device." For a heartbeat, nobody moved, as if the room itself needed permission to breathe. Dr. Nolan Price stared at Avery's circled note, then at the log line glowing on the side screen, and his fingers lowered to the keyboard with the careful precision of someone defusing a crisis without making it worse. He typed a command, not dramatic, not loud, just exact, and the maintenance task that had been masquerading as harmless suddenly paused. The red warning band on the main wall hesitated. Once, twice. Then the pulsing stopped altogether, like a metronome finally silenced. The emergency chime faded into nothing, and the display shifted from angry crimson back to clean blue, the kind of blue that meant control had returned to the people who claimed they deserved it. A collective inhale swept the table, soft and disbelieving, followed by the quiet sound of glass setting down on marble. "Victor." Haynes smiled too quickly, then corrected it into something calmer, as if he had rehearsed innocence in front of mirrors. "So," he said lightly, spreading his hands, "a lucky guess." The engineer pressed a button. The breach stopped. "We can all move on." His tone tried to turn a storm into a misunderstanding, but his eyes had lost their easy shine. Omar Sterling did not look at the screen. Omar looked at Victor the way he looked at fine print. "That was not a guess," Omar said. His voice remained calm, but the temperature in it dropped. "She named a source. She named a rhythm. She named a device." Victor gave a small laugh that sounded thin in the restored silence. "You are going to take the word of a teenager who was pushing a cart?" he said, and he tilted his chin toward Avery as if she were a stain someone should clean. "This is a boardroom, Omar, not a classroom." Omar did not react to the insult. He turned slightly toward Dr. Price. "Show me the identifier," Omar said. Dr. Price swallowed and enlarged the log entry, projecting the hardware tag in bright white characters. Avery could feel her mother behind her, so still that it was like Grace was afraid movement itself would draw punishment. Victor leaned forward a fraction, then leaned back, as if he had touched something hot without using his hands. "Identifiers can be spoofed," Victor said quickly. "Everyone here knows that. Anyone could make it look like it came from my device." Omar's gaze did not blink. "Then you will have no problem giving us your device?" Omar replied. It was not a request. It was a conclusion. Victor's jaw tightened, just for a moment, before he smoothed it away. "This is ridiculous," he said, reaching into his inner pocket with slow, offended dignity. He produced a sleek phone and set it on the table like a man placing down a winning card. "There. Happy." Omar did not touch it. He nodded once, and a suited security manager who had been standing near the glass doors stepped forward, gloved hands careful, professional. Dr. Price connected the phone to a secure reader and pulled up the device certificate, the kind that executives like to pretend they understood. The identifier matched. Clean. Exact. The room did not gasp this time. The silence was heavier than any sound. Victor's smile faltered again, and now it did not return. "This is a setup," he said, but his voice had lost its polish. "Someone is trying to make me look guilty. Someone in engineering. Someone who wants my seat." Omar Sterling finally moved, rising from his chair with a smoothness that made everyone else feel clumsy. "If this is a setup," Omar said, "then the logs will tell that story too. And if it is not, then you have just attempted to sabotage a demonstration in front of people whose trust is measured in billions." He turned his head slightly toward the security manager. "Escort Mr. Haynes to a private room," Omar said, still not raising his voice. "And bring compliance in." Quietly, Victor opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it when he realized nobody was laughing anymore. Two security staff approached with calm, open hands, guiding him toward the doors without a scene, without shouting, the way real power removes noise instead of creating it. As Victor passed Avery, his eyes flicked toward her, sharp and resentful, but Avery did not flinch. She simply watched him go, pen still in her fingers, as if truth had weight, and she had finally learned how to hold it. When the doors shut, the skyline outside looked the same, glittering and indifferent, but inside the glass cathedral, the room had changed. Omar turned back to Avery, studying her as if she were an equation he had not expected to see tonight. "What is your name?" he asked. Avery felt every gaze in the room shift onto her like a spotlight sliding across glass. The alarms were gone, the screens calm again, but the silence was louder now because it had turned into attention. Omar Sterling stood at the head of the table, tall and composed, and when he asked, "What is your name?" it did not sound like small talk. It sounded like a door opening. Avery swallowed once, steadying herself the way she had learned to do in hallways and waiting rooms where nobody offered her a chair. "My name is Avery Bennett," she said. The words floated over the marble and leather, simple and unadorned, and for the first time tonight, she did not try to make herself smaller. Omar's eyes flicked, briefly, toward Grace, who stood with her hands folded and her shoulders tense, bracing for consequences even after the crisis had ended. "Bennett," Omar repeated, as if he were tasting the name for meaning. Then he looked back at Avery. "You saw something my engineers did not," he said. "Tell me what you saw." Victor was gone behind closed doors, but his shadow still lingered in the room, in the way some executives avoided eye contact, in the way a few people suddenly found their water glasses fascinating. Dr. Nolan Price stayed near his laptop, watching Avery as if she were the only stable ground in a room that had started to tilt. Avery lifted her notepad slightly, the pen still warm in her fingers. "The breach was too clean," she said. It repeated every 12 seconds. "Real problems do not keep perfect time." The log entries had a loop, and the loop had permission. That means it was not a stranger breaking in. It was a trusted key being used the wrong way. Omar held her gaze. "And you knew to ask for logs," he said. "You knew to look for a source tag." His voice remained even, but a new note lived beneath it now, something close to curiosity. "Who taught you?" Avery glanced at her mother for half a heartbeat. Grace looked frightened and proud at the same time, like someone watching a fragile thing stand up in a storm. Avery turned back. "Nobody in this room," she said. "I learned from public courses and books. I practiced when I had time." She did not say the rest out loud, but the truth sat behind her words. She practiced while waiting for Grace to finish late shifts, while the building slept, while other kids had tutors and quiet bedrooms. Omar's attention sharpened, not unkindly, but intensely, the way he might study a rare asset he had not known existed. "You are in high school," he said, not asking, but noting. Avery nodded. "Yes, sir." Omar took one slow step closer, stopping at a respectful distance, and the people around the table leaned in without realizing it, drawn to the gravity of what was happening. "Then listen carefully." Omar said. Tonight was a test. Not the one I announced, but it became one. You stopped a sabotage attempt in front of my witnesses. Now I want to see if you can do the second part. He turned his head toward Nolan. Restart the demonstration, Omar said. From the beginning. Run the platform at full load. No shortcuts. Then Omar looked back at Avery. And you will stand with Dr. Price and tell him exactly what to do to close the hole, not just pause the loop. If the system holds, we continue the deal. If it fails, we all learn something expensive. A murmur rippled through the executives, not laughter this time, but uneasy respect. Grace's breath hitched, as if she wanted to protest, as if she wanted to protect her daughter from another round of judgment. But Avery lifted her hand slightly toward her mother, a small, quiet promise. Omar's voice lowered, controlled and unmistakable. One more thing, he added, eyes fixed on Avery. Before you touch anything, tell me what you want in return. Avery did not look at the chandelier or the skyline or the polished marble that made her reflection seem sharper than she felt. She looked at Omar Sterling, because she understood something now. In rooms like this, asking for what you deserved was its own kind of test. She held the pen between her fingers, ink smudged slightly on her thumb, and answered with a steadiness that surprised even her. I want my mother's job protected, she said. Not for tonight. For good. I want her schedule made reasonable, and I want her treated like a person, not a risk. A few executives shifted in their chairs, as if those words were heavier than numbers. Avery continued before anyone could interrupt. And I want a chance to learn properly. Access to real training, mentorship, and a scholarship plan that does not disappear when this room forgets my name. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. This one was not fear. It was recalibration. Omar Sterling watched her as if she had just spoken in a currency he respected. You do not want the money, he said, not accusing, simply measuring. Avery met his gaze. Money is a tool, she replied. My mother's dignity is not for sale, and my future should not depend on whether someone like Victor Haynes has a bad day. Dr. Nolan Price's shoulders loosened as if he had been holding his breath for hours. Grace's eyes glistened, but she stayed still because she had spent years learning that tears in rich rooms were rarely forgiven. Omar's face did. Not soften, but something in his attention did, a fraction warmer, a fraction more human. Agreed, he said. One word, clean as a signature. Then he turned to Nolan. Restart, Omar ordered. Full load. Nolan's hands moved quickly now, confidence returning like color to a picture. The main display reset, graphs rising, systems spinning up, the platform drawing power and data like a plane preparing for takeoff. Numbers streamed down the wall in bright lines, and a performance meter climbed, 60%, 75, 90, the system pushing hard enough that a lesser mistake would have cracked. Omar kept his eyes on Avery. Now, he said. Close it. Avery stepped beside Nolan, close enough to read every line, far enough to keep her hands to herself. First, she said, you revoke the trusted maintenance profile that is running the loop. Not later, now? Then you rotate the signing keys for internal tasks so anything unsigned gets rejected immediately. Nolan nodded, typing as she spoke, his screen filling with confirmation prompts. Avery watched the log stream change in real time, the 12-second pulse dissolving into natural variability. Second, she said, you quarantine all devices in this room from the trusted network until they re-authenticate through a clean gateway. The system should never trust a phone or tablet as a maintenance authority, even if it has a certificate. An executive coughed softly, uneasy at the implication that their own convenience had been a vulnerability. Avery did not pause. Third, she said, and she lifted her notepad so Omar could see the simplicity of her handwriting. You add a rule. Any maintenance task that triggers a lock routine must require a second validation, not a password, an approval from a separate admin key. 2 people, 2 keys. No single point of ego. Omar's gaze stayed fixed, and for the first time the room began to look at Avery the way it looked at Omar, as someone whose words could change outcomes. Nolan executed the last command, and the platform's status bar flashed green, integrity verified. The performance meter held steady at 98% under full load. No alarms. No red band. Just clean blue and stable lines, like calm water after a storm. Omar Sterling's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something like astonishment he refused to display too openly. He glanced at the executives, then back at Avery. "You did not just fix a breach," he said quietly. "You redesigned my safeguards in 5 minutes." Avery set the pen down, palms open, as if to show she had nothing to hide. "I did not redesign them," she said. "I only removed the part where someone could hide behind power." The room did not erupt into cheers, because this was not the kind of place that clapped for miracles. Instead, it went still in a way that felt almost reverent, as if the glass walls and marble floors had to adjust to a new truth. The main display held steady in calm blue, integrity verified, performance stable, and the executives who had been ready to smile through a disaster now stared at the screen like it had rewritten their understanding of who belonged at this table. Dr. Nolan Price exhaled slowly, one hand braced on the edge of his laptop, as though his knees had finally remembered they were holding him up. A woman in a slate-gray suit blinked twice and whispered something to her neighbor that sounded like, "She is 17, with the same awe people reserve for a headline. Omar Sterling stood perfectly composed, but even he could not hide the small shift in his expression, the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth that signaled he had just witnessed something rare. He turned his gaze across the room, measuring the faces one by one, and when he spoke, his voice carried the calm weight of a decision that would ripple past this night. "We continue," he said. "The platform holds. The safeguards are improved, and the partnership moves forward." A few people nodded quickly, relieved to have certainty again, but their relief had been reshaped into respect. Omar's eyes moved to the far end of the table where the lead investor representative sat, a man who had been silent through the entire ordeal, watching more than talking. "You wanted proof," Omar said. "You have it. Not in rehearsed slides, but in stress. That is where systems reveal their character." The representative's jaw worked once, as if he had been preparing objections and now had to swallow them. "Agreed," he said, and the words sounded like a signature. Omar did not celebrate. He simply lifted his hand and made a small gesture toward the security manager near the glass doors. "Compliance will document everything," Omar said. "Full audit. Full transparency." Quietly and professionally. Then his gaze returned to Avery, and the entire room followed it without realizing. "Mr. Haynes believed power could hide him," Omar said, his tone even, not theatrical. "He believed a young woman in a service uniform would be an easy scapegoat. He was wrong." Avery felt her mother's breath catch behind her, and she turned just enough to see Grace's eyes shining, not with tears that asked for pity, but with a pride that had survived years of being overlooked. Omar's attention softened by a fraction when it landed on Grace. "Grace Bennett," he said, reading the name from a small badge that had never mattered to anyone here until now. "Your work kept this place running. Tonight, you will not be punished for someone else's arrogance." He looked back at Avery. "And you," he said, "asked for dignity and opportunity instead of a paycheck you did not earn the easy way. That tells me more than any resume ever could." A low murmur traveled around the table, the kind that sounded like shifting opinions. Omar reached into his jacket and removed a slim card, placing it on the marble in front of Avery like a deliberate promise. "Sterling Horizon will fund your education," he said. "Full scholarship, mentorship, and paid internship when you are ready. And your mother's employment will be protected with humane hours and written respect, not informal favors." Several executives exchanged looks, because written respect was rarer than money. Omar's gaze remained steady. "As for the 100 million, he continued, and now the room leaned in as if pulled by gravity. "I will not hand it to a teenager to turn her life into a spectacle. I will place it into a scholarship fund under your name, focused on students who have talent and no access. You will help choose the first recipients when the time comes." Avery's throat tightened, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, because she could feel the weight of that number and the weight of what it meant to be trusted with it. For the first time all night, the room looked at the maid's daughter not as a curiosity, but as someone who had quietly changed the direction of a billionaire's plans. And somewhere beyond the glass, the city kept glittering, unaware that inside this sky-high cathedral of money, a different kind of value had just taken the seat nobody wanted to offer. The signatures happened without fireworks, because in that sky-high room the loudest sound was always the quiet scrape of a pen. The investor representative asked a few final questions in a voice that had lost its earlier certainty, and Dr. Nolan Price answered with a steadiness that came from having his system tested in the only way that mattered. Omar Sterling did not linger in celebration. He moved with the controlled pace of someone who believed promises should become documents before the night had a chance to turn them into rumors. A legal counsel appeared as if summoned by gravity. Papers were printed on thick stock that felt almost too clean to touch, and Grace Bennett watched in disbelief as her name was typed into a formal addendum. Protected employment, consistent hours, respectful workplace standards, written in the same language that guarded billion-dollar deals. Avery stood beside her mother, hands folded, still half expecting someone to snap and say it had all been a mistake. But Omar only glanced at her once and nodded like this was simply what honor looked like when it finally showed up. When the meeting ended, the executives filed out more quietly than they had arrived, their eyes no longer sliding past the service card without seeing the person behind it. A few offered small, awkward congratulations, the kind that sounded unfamiliar in their mouths, and one woman in a slate-gray suit stopped long enough to say, "Do not let anyone make you small again," as if she were speaking to herself too. Outside the conference doors, the hallway lighting was softer, less dramatic, and for the first time all night Grace exhaled fully, like she had been holding her breath for years. In the elevator ride down, the glass walls revealed the city in slow motion, lights drifting upward as they descended, and Grace finally reached for Avery's hand, squeezing it once with trembling fingers. "I am sorry," Grace whispered, the words barely audible over the quiet hum. "I brought you into that room." Avery tightened her grip. "You brought me into a building," she said gently. "I brought myself into the moment." When they stepped out into the lobby, the air felt warmer, less curated, and the lemon polish scent faded into the ordinary smell of night and pavement and distant food carts. A driver in a dark suit approached, respectful, holding a simple envelope and a phone number written in clean handwriting. "Mr. Sterling asked me to give you this," he said to Avery, then added to Grace, "and to confirm your schedule will be adjusted starting tomorrow. You will not be closing alone." Grace blinked as if the words were too kind to be real. Avery opened the envelope later, not in the lobby, but in the quiet of their small apartment where the refrigerator hummed and the walls held years of ordinary life. Inside was a letter on heavy paper, brief and precise, an invitation to a summer program, a list of mentors, and a promise of tuition support with clear terms, not vague encouragement. At the bottom was Omar Sterling's signature, sharp and unmistakable, and beneath it a single line that felt like a door left open on purpose. "You noticed what others refused to see. Keep noticing." Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pages as if they might evaporate. Then she looked at Avery with a softness that made her eyes shine. "All those nights," she said, voice thick, "you were listening in the hallways." Avery nodded, a small smile forming despite the exhaustion in her bones. "I was not wasting time," she said. "I was building something." And for the first time in their lives, the future did not feel like a wall. It felt like a hallway with lights on. 6 months later, the world looked different, not because the skyline had changed, but because Avery Bennett no longer had to stand at the edge of it. The first morning of the summer program, she walked into a training lab that smelled like fresh coffee and warm circuitry instead of lemon polish, and the desks were scattered with laptops, notebooks, and quiet ambition. Nobody asked her whose daughter she was. Nobody looked at her shoes. The mentor spoke to her the way people speak to someone they expect to understand, and for the first time, Avery realized how much energy she had spent in her life just trying to be taken seriously. Dr. Nolan Price checked in weekly, not as a savior, but as a steady presence, someone who knew what it meant to carry pressure and still choose integrity. He showed her how professionals documented risks, how systems were strengthened without ego, and how trust could be engineered the same way security could, with layers, with transparency, with accountability. Back at the glass building, Grace Bennett's schedule changed exactly as promised. She worked humane hours, she had support on late shifts, and the disrespect that used to float through hallways like perfume was replaced by something more practical and more rare, professionalism. People began to say good morning to her. People began to ask, not demand. It did not erase the years she had been overlooked, but it stopped adding new bruises to old memories, and that was its own kind of healing. Omar Sterling kept his promises quietly, the way he made decisions, and the scholarship fund was announced without a spectacle, not as a headline about charity, but as a structured commitment with rules, audits, and a board that included educators who actually knew what students needed. Avery read the draft documents in a small office one afternoon, her fingers tracing the lines like they were proof that words could protect people when they were written with intention. She did not feel like a mascot. She felt like a participant. When the day came to review the first applicants, the meeting was held in a modest community center room, not in a penthouse, and the chairs were plain, the lighting soft, the air ordinary. Avery sat with a folder of essays and transcripts, and as she read, she recognized the same quiet hunger she had carried for years, the same late-night learning done in corners and borrowed moments. One applicant had written about studying math on a phone during bus rides. Another had built a small security tool in a public library because home was too loud for concentration. Avery realized then that talent was not rare, access was. Omar Sterling attended that meeting for less than 20 minutes, said very little, and listened more than he spoke. When Avery recommended the first recipients, he nodded once, the same simple motion he had given her in the glass room, and it felt like respect without performance. Later, walking home beside her mother under streetlights that buzzed softly, Avery thought about how quickly people had laughed at her uniform and how quickly they had gone silent when the truth appeared on a screen. The lesson was not that money was evil or that rich rooms were always cruel. The lesson was smaller and sharper. People often confuse a label for a life, a job for a mind, a background for a limit. And the day someone chooses to see past that confusion, everything changes, not with shouting, but with a calm, undeniable shift in what is possible. Avery squeezed Grace's hand once, and Grace squeezed back, and in that ordinary gesture lived a kind of justice that did not need applause to be real. 2 years after the night the Skylab turned red, Avery Bennett stood in a bright auditorium that smelled like fresh paint and new carpet, the kind of place built for beginnings instead of verdicts. On the stage behind her, a simple banner carried the name of the scholarship fund, and beneath it sat the first class of recipients, teenagers in thrifted blazers and borrowed confidence, each one holding a folder that represented something they had never been handed before: access. Avery did not wear a service uniform anymore. She wore a plain navy suit that fit her like she belonged in her own life. And when she spoke into the microphone, her voice did not shake, not because she had become fearless, but because she had learned that courage could be quiet and still be real. In the front row, Grace Bennett sat with her hands folded in her lap, shoulders relaxed in a way Avery had never seen when she was younger, because her mother no longer lived in constant worry about one bad day taking everything. Grace worked steady hours now. She had weekends. She had mornings where coffee was not gulped in a rush. She had dignity written into policies instead of begged from moods. Omar Sterling sat a few seats away, listening with the same focused calm he had shown in the glass room. But something about him had changed too, as if that night had reminded him that control without character was just another kind of vulnerability. Victor Haynes was not there. He had left the company under the quiet weight of audits and consequences that did not need headlines to be final, and the building ran better without his cruelty hiding behind competence. After the ceremony, Avery walked outside with her mother into warm sunlight, and for a moment they simply stood on the sidewalk, watching students laugh and take photos, watching parents hug their children like the future had finally become something touchable. Grace turned to Avery, eyes soft. "I used to think the world only listened to people with titles," she said. Avery smiled, small and steady. "The world listens to truth when it is brave enough to stand up," she replied, and she meant it in a way that did not sound like a slogan, because she had lived the cost of standing up and the reward of doing it anyway. That night in the Skylab had been framed as a challenge, a spectacle, a billionaire's game. But what happened after proved something deeper. The richest thing in any room is not the marble or the skyline or the number written on a contract. It is the unseen effort people carry when nobody is watching, the late nights, the quiet studying, the unglamorous discipline that builds skill, and the integrity that refuses to let power rewrite reality. Avery had not won because she was lucky. She had won because she had been underestimated for so long that she learned to observe what others ignored. And then, when her moment arrived, She chose to protect her mother's dignity and create a door for others, not just walk through it alone. As they started home, Grace slipped her hand into Avery's, and Avery squeezed back, feeling the simplest kind of wealth there is: safety, respect, and a future that no longer required permission.